Welcome to my presentation. I'm Shusaku Nakayama. Right now, I'm an assistant professor at Osaka University of Economics and Law. The title of my presentation is Current Trend in Contrastive Interlanguage Analysis, a Case Study. Contrastive interlanguage analysis is one way of interlanguage analysis which are being used from the late 1990s. This analytics has changed a little bit from the original version. So in this presentation, I will report results of a case study analyzed based on the new contrastive interlanguage analysis. Here is the contents of the presentation. First, as an introduction, I'll explain what contrastive interlanguage analysis is like. Next, I'll explain the linguistic feature I adapted for this case study, modal auxiliary verbs. Then, I'll show research questions and a methodology. And lastly, I'll mainly discuss what the new contrastive interlanguage analysis benefits us. Let me begin with the explanation of contrastive interlanguage analysis. Contrastive interlanguage analysis was introduced by Gwangju in 1996 as a methodological framework for exploring interlanguage analysis, CIA. CIA has two variations in its analytical ways: a comparison of different interlanguages of the same language, as in the right side, and a comparison of interlanguages and the native speaker language varieties, as in the left side. The former approach aims to identify language use specific to learners from a specific L1 background, as well as common characteristics among learners of the language. On the other hand, what the latter approach does is to explore non-native features of one national group. And the research findings have been used to discuss how to bridge the differences in language use between them, and to expect areas where learners are likely to have difficulty. Many corpus linguists have analyzed interlanguages relative to a native speaker language in order to evaluate interlanguages. However, CIA has been met with criticism from researchers, especially against comparisons of interlanguages with native speaker language varieties. Opponents of CIA often advocate the comparative fallacy hypothesis, which argues that comparisons make what learners can do broad and look degraded. For example, Aston argued that one shouldn't presuppose that a native speaker language is a norm that learners should conform to. This is because differences in language use between learners and native speakers are not negative evidence, but just differences in the use of strategy for achieving one's communicative purpose. In this regard, he criticized using negative terms such as overuse and underuse, which are often used in CIA analysis. Also, English is now used as a tool for communication between non-native speakers rather than between native speakers. That is, English is used as a lingua franca. English as a lingua franca has established its unique language system. So non-native speaker language is also one of the varieties of English, just as the UK English and the US English. In this sense, it's not a right judgment to conclude that different language use from native speakers means errors or immaturity. The previous slide will arise one issue to consider. The role of native speaker language as a reference point is over. According to some researchers, we don't have to ignore native speaker language variety as a reference point. Gilkin conducted a survey to their students on what language variety they aim for. According to survey results, Most of their students considered native speaker language to be their running goal. Asked about which language variety they would teach, over 90% of her students opted for native speaker language varieties. Besides, Japanese teachers of English were inclined to deem native speaker varieties to be their running goals in English pronunciation. Therefore, native speaker language variety can be still a possible reference point for many learners in order to evaluate their current English levels. That doesn't mean native speaker language variety must be considered in exploring interlanguages. Without any reference points which learners aim for, however, it would be hard to discuss how they can improve their own English. Partly in reaction to the criticisms against the CIA, a new version of CIA was proposed by Granger in 2015. Unlike the original CIA, where reference points are almost always native speaker corpora, the new CIA suggests evaluating interlanguages against multiple language varieties, such as New Englishes, Hong Kong English and Indian English, for example, and the English produced by competent learners as a representation of English as a lingua franca. Notably, the new CIA no longer relies exclusively on native speaker varieties. Both of the two CIAs certainly include the risk of making us consider interlanguages degraded. But we may not have to ignore the informativeness of these approaches. Abolishing CIA simultaneously means that we give up the chance of obtaining insights into interlanguages and language education. So in this study, I adapted proficiency learners besides native speakers as reference points. As a case study, I performed a new CIA on the use of English modal auxiliary verbs. I mean can, will, may, shall, and their corresponding past tense forms plus must. Semantic notions conveyed through modal verbs are called modality, and they are classified in several ways. One of the most widely used ways is that by quotes. She divided modalities into two types, epistemic modality and the root modality. Epistemic modalities express the speaker's assumptions or assessment of truth values. This type of modality expresses possibility, prediction, certainty, and so on. Root modality, on the other hand, is used to express permission, obligation, as well as speaker's ability and willingness to do something. However, as Palmer indicated, root modality includes apparently different meanings. For example, the root modality of can includes permission and ability. So he further divided root modality into two modalities, deontic modality and dynamic modality. Deontic modality expresses permission, obligation, and a dynamic modality expresses volition and ability. Here is a summary of modalities. Can and could convey all the three types of modalities. For may and might, epistemic and deontic modalities. For will and would, epistemic and dynamic modalities. For should and must, epistemic and deontic modalities. The use of shall is decreasing at a rapid rate, and now it's found with just first-person subjects as in shall I or shall we. So this study focused only on this usage. Here are research questions. The first research question is, which modalities did Japanese learners over and underuse relative to native speakers and proficient learners? The second research question is, how does adapting two different reference points, so native speaker and the proficient learners, affect interpretations of comparison results? So next, let us move on to methodology. I adapted the International Corpus Network of Asian Learners of English, ICNEL, and which is composed of language data gathered from native speakers and Asian learners from 10 different L1 backgrounds. The corpus includes a spoken corpus and a written corpus, and in this study, I used only spoken dialogue module in the spoken corpus. Spoken dialogue data was gathered from interviews between college students and the trained interviewers, and all the participants were engaged in the same tasks, and the interview length was about 40 minutes. The ICNEL corpus classifies learners' levels of English proficiency by CFR linked proficiency bands, B2 plus, B1-2, B1-1, and A2. So we can choose language produced by learners at particular proficiency levels, enabling one to analyze how learners' use of an item changes with development of their English proficiency. Representing English as a lingua franca, proficient learner data was assumed to serve as another reasonable benchmark against learners. Unfortunately, however, the ICNEL corpus doesn't specify proficiency levels of learners at the B2 level or above, and they are all categorized into the same level, B2 plus. As such, I manually recategorized their proficiency levels on the basis of their English scores. And then we got learners at C1 and C2 level. So I got 11 learners at the C1 or C2 levels. Next, I'll explain statistical tests I used to investigate differences in frequency of use of each modality between Japanese learners and the two reference points. First, I performed the Shapiro-Wilk test, and the normality was not secured between comparison groups. So non-parametric tests were found to be appropriate. Among several of them, the Steele's test seemed to be the most suitable option for the study. Then please look at the bottom of the slide. Let's say we have three groups under analysis, two of learner groups and one of native speaker group. In this case, there are three patterns of comparisons theoretically. However, in CIA, interlanguages are evaluated against a reference point, in this study, native speaker and the proficient learners. This means that it is not necessary to make comparisons between Japanese learners, as in the right side. And this type of comparisons, pairwise multiple comparisons for all the pairs of the reference point and the learner group, can be done with the Steele's test. So I performed the Steele's test in this study. Then let us move on to analysis results. Here is the results of the Steele's test on comparisons between Japanese learners and native speakers. The asterisks in blue indicate the modality underused by Japanese learners at a statistically significant level. First and most importantly, all the modalities that significant differences were found were those that learners underused. Overall, those modalities were underused by learners at all the four proficiency levels. A few exceptions were the epistemic modalities of may, might, will, the deontic modality of can, and the dynamic modalities of could and will, because for these modalities, significant differences were not found for learners at the B2 plus. Next, here are results of the series test on comparisons between Japanese runners and the proficient runners. The asterisks in light blue indicate modalities underused by Japanese runners. Here again, there were no modalities that Japanese runners overused, and most of the underused modalities were by all the levels of runners. As the comparison results against native speakers, Japanese runners tended to underuse epistemic modalities and dynamic modalities. In order to investigate differences in the comparison results between the two reference points, I summarized the results in this table. The asterisks in blue and those in light blue respectively indicate the modalities Japanese runners underused relative to native speakers and the proficient runners. Overall, the results of the comparisons with the two different reference points had similarities. Specifically, significant differences were found for the use of the epistemic modalities of may, might, will, would, and the dynamic modalities of will and would. Then, let's move on to the discussion. The first research question was, which modality did Japanese runners over and underuse relative to native speakers and the proficient runners? First, there were no modalities that Japanese runners overused. Interestingly, despite which of the reference points used, the modalities Japanese runners underused didn't widely differ from each other. Specifically, Japanese runners tended to underuse the epistemic modalities of may, might, will, would, and the dynamic modalities of will and would. These modalities were underused by all the levels of runners. Additionally, there were several underused modalities that were not common between the two comparisons. The epistemic and the dynamic modalities of could were underused relative to native speakers. The dynamic modality of can was underused relative to proficient runners. The second research question was, how does adapting two reference points change interpretations of comparison results? First, this study found several underused modalities that statistically significant differences were found against only either of the reference points. So, by adapting different reference points, it becomes possible to provide beneficial insights into learners and teachers depending on their learning goals. On the other hand, we got common findings between the two comparisons. That is, several of the modalities were underused by learners relative to not only native speakers, but also proficient learners. These findings can possibly indicate not just differences in language use, rather, they would be challenging but worthwhile linguistic features for learners, because those are what native speakers and proficient learners often use, and therefore must be useful in speaking. In this sense, comparison results in common can potentially inform us of what to learn in order to improve English skills. And this would be valuable for language teachers and the developers of teaching materials and syllabi. With a single reference point, it would be hard to determine whether deviated language use indicates just differences in language use or instances of what to learn to improve their English skills. Given that common findings between the two comparisons better evaluate interlanguages, It might be possible to estimate how learners' knowledge of a linguistic feature of interest develops. In this study, there were underused modalities that significant differences was not found only for learners at the B2 plus level. This suggests that learners become able to use the modalities in a way that is similar to native speakers and proficient learners when they reach at the level. However, this study leaves out the detailed discussion and just indicates this possibility. Lastly, let me end my presentation with suggestions for future research. First, this study found many modalities underused by learners relative to native speakers and proficient learners. However, it's possible that learners can use other linguistic features corresponding to the underused modalities, like maybe as a corresponding expression to the epistemic modality of may. Investigating this point can help us better understand the reasons behind learners' underuse of epistemic and dynamic modalities. Likewise, to identify what caused such deviated use, it will be valuable for people involved in English teaching. According to Nakayama in 2024, Japanese learners seem to have difficulty in epistemic modality. So, the underuse of epistemic modalities this study found might be due to learners' lack of knowledge of it. Here are references. And thank you very much for watching my presentation. If you have any comments and questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.